How on earth do you find a single person who lived 2,000 years ago? A person who left behind no writings of their own, and yet somehow became the most influential figure in all of human history? Well, today we're diving right into that puzzle. The search for the historical Jesus. Okay, first things first. We've got to make a really important distinction here. On one hand, you have the Jesus of faith. That's the figure of theology, the Christ you hear about in church. But on the other hand, you have the historical Jesus. And that's the person that historians try to piece together, using the exact same tools they'd use for any other ancient figure, like say Socrates or Julius Caesar. It's that second one, that historical detective work, that we're digging into. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with how this whole quest got started, then we'll look at the few things that scholars actually agree on. After that, we'll open up the detective's toolkit they use, check out the very different portraits of Jesus that they come up with, and finally ask why this whole search is still so captivating. So where did this whole idea even come from? This effort to kind of peel back all the layers of theology to find the actual person underneath? Well, it really kicked into high gear back in the Enlightenment, when scholars started looking at ancient texts with a whole new critical eye. The big idea here is this: treat the Gospels not as perfect, divinely inspired scripture, but as historical sources. You know, these are documents written by real people with their own beliefs and agendas at a specific time in history. So the goal is to analyze them critically and see what we can plausibly, historically, piece together about the man from Galilee. Okay, so if we're using that critical historical method, what can we actually say? Is there any common ground here? Do historians, religious, secular, you name it, agree on anything? The answer is yes, but you might be surprised at how short that list really is. And here's the first thing, the absolute baseline. You might see stuff online arguing that Jesus was a complete myth, that he never existed. But in academic circles, that's a real fringe theory. As the scholar Bart Ehrman puts it, pretty much every single competent expert in the field agrees he was a real, living, breathing person. But, and this is a huge but, the second you move past the fact that he existed, that solid ground just evaporates. When it comes to the actual events of his life, there are only two, just two, that have that same kind of near-universal agreement among scholars. And here they are. These are the two historical pillars, the anchor points that almost every single scholarly reconstruction is built on. 1, he was baptized by a prophet known as John the Baptist. And 2, he was executed by crucifixion under the authority of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Okay, but wait a minute. How in the world do they get there? How can they be so sure about those two things but debate pretty much everything else? Well, it all comes down to the evidence they have to work with and the special methods they use to analyze it. Here's a quick look at the source material. The earliest writings we have are the letters of Paul, written just a couple of decades after Jesus' death, which is incredibly close for ancient history. Then you have the Gospels. But what's really crucial is that we also have non-Christian sources. Both the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus mention Jesus and his execution. Now, to sift through all this stuff, scholars can't just take it at face value. They developed a set of guidelines, kind of like rules of thumb, called the Criteria of Authenticity. You can think of them as the forensic tools a detective uses to figure out which clues are reliable and which ones aren't. And one of the most powerful of these tools is called the Criterion of Embarrassment. The logic behind it is actually pretty simple and kind of brilliant. It basically says that if a story has details that would have been awkward or even problematic for the early Christians telling it, well, it's highly unlikely they just made that part up. And this gets us right back to the baptism. Just think about it for a second. If you're trying to convince the world that your leader is the all-powerful Son of God, why would you invent a story where he goes and submits to a baptism for the forgiveness of sins from somebody else? It makes him look like John the Baptist Jr. It's embarrassing. And historians argue they wouldn't have invented it. The only reason to include such an awkward story is because it was a well-known fact they just couldn't ignore. So, in a weird twist, the very embarrassment of the story becomes a powerful argument that it actually happened. Okay, so we've got our foundation. He existed, he was baptized, and he was crucified. But once you step off that solid ground, poof, the consensus just shatters, and scholars start to paint very, very different portraits of who this Jesus guy actually was. And this is where you just see this incredible variety of interpretations. Depending on which pieces of evidence a scholar thinks are most important, Jesus can be seen as an apocalyptic prophet mourning that the world was about to end, or a wandering philosopher challenging social rules, or a charismatic healer, or a prophet pushing for radical social change. So, for instance, you'll have scholars like Bart Ehrman, who are convinced Jesus was an apocalypticist, who thought God was about to smash into history and end the world as we know it. But then you have someone like John Dominic Crossan, who sees a kind of peasant sage whose radical ideas about equality were a huge threat to the status quo. And the amazing thing is, they're both building their very different cases from the exact same sources. So all of these conflicting portraits lead to a really big question, right? If the experts can't agree, what's the point of all this? Are we getting any closer to finding the real Jesus? Well, this gets at a huge shift in how scholars think about this stuff today. The old idea that we could find one, single, objective, real Jesus is now seen by many as, well, an illusion. We don't have a diary or an autobiography. All we have are the memories and interpretations of his followers. The best we can do is create a reconstruction, a historical model, out of the fragments we have left. And maybe that's the real goal now. Maybe the quest for the historical Jesus tells us just as much about history, memory, and how stories get told as it does about this one man. The point isn't to end up with a perfect photograph, but to understand the world he lived in and to try and grasp the monumental impact he had that made so many people remember him in so many powerful ways. And that's the final thought I'll leave you with. Is the search really about finding one man? Or is it about understanding the explosion of meaning and memory that he ignited? An explosion that is still expanding and shaping our world 2 millennia later.